Barcelona, Spain, 1936. Bullets smash into the makeshift barricade you are sheltering behind as armed anarchists try to breach your position. "We can't last much longer like this. Where are the rest of the troops?" You yell out to your friend Juan as you fire back. The whole street has turned into a shooting gallery, snipers firing from buildings above, but on the ground you're surrounded. "Probably having the same problems we are," yells back Juan, "if they're even still alive." Blood sprays into your face as the soldier next to you's head explodes and he falls to the ground. Scanning the tall buildings around you, you spot a rifle pointing out of a window and duck just in time as a bullet hits exactly where your head had just been. You rake the window with bullets, feeling relief as the rifle muzzle disappears from view. The machine guns on the barricade open up as anarchists charge out from their defences. Most are cut down, but one manages to throw something into your position. As you dive to the floor, a blinding flash and the heat of an explosion burns your face. When you open your eyes, you can see Juan lying on the floor, his now lifeless eyes staring back at you. Peering over the barricade, you can see another red in mid-throw. Raising your rifle, you frantically fire in his direction, and he crumples up and falls to the floor. Seconds later, an explosion erupts where he stood. This was meant to be easy. How the hell are they so unarmed? Then a sight appears that freezes the blood in your veins. A truck, covered in steel plate, speeds down the road towards the barricade. Your officer yells out, "He's going to ram us! Take him out quickly!" The machine guns chatter, and your own rifle barks. But the bullets just bounce off the armour as someone screams, "Too late!" I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebeten. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. Last episode we saw how the Spanish Civil War had been brewing for a long time, the two Spains snarling at each other across a growing divide. On one side, the eternal Spain that believed in the church, tradition, the army, centralised power and protecting the social order. On the other side was the Spain of those who did not eat, who believed in cutting the church and landlords down to size, federalism, land reform and modernisation. By the 1930s, repression and corruption could no longer keep the state stable. As Spain fell into chaos, the army rose up to overthrow the republic. Yet the very divisions that caused the coup also meant they could only partially succeed. For one of the two Spains to triumph over the other, it was going to take war, terror, and total victory. The July coup launched by the army was actually something of a failure. For a coup to succeed, it needs the majority of the population to either support it, or at least be apathetic about the change of power. That certainly wasn't true of Spain in 1936. A civil war broke out because, while the coup was wildly popular in some areas, in others it was completely crushed. Spain was literally split almost in half geographically. The coup seemed to start well. It was launched a day early, on July the 17th, in Spanish Morocco, due to the plot being uncovered by pro-Republic officials. With the Spanish Foreign Legion and the Army of Africa on the rebels' side, It was no contest. Those that did try to resist were soon overwhelmed, then imprisoned in camps in the desert. Soon they would all be shot by members of the Falange, Spain's fascist party. In the 21st century, it can seem bizarre that the majority Muslim colonial army of Africa would join forces with far-right Catholic generals. It occurred because it was essentially a mercenary army, loyal not to Spain, but to the officers who had won their respect. That's why Franco was so important. They almost worshipped him, believing he was under Allah's protection as he had survived so many incidents that would have killed another man. Added to this, the Republic hadn't just clamped down on the Catholic Church. The Muslim authorities in Morocco had felt their secularizing efforts as well. In turn, they were only too happy to tell the Moroccan troops that this was a jihad against godless communism. The coup also had great success in northwestern Spain. Burgos, the city of El Cid, declared for the rebels without a struggle, as one aristocrat boasted, quote, "The very stones are nationalist here," end quote. In Pamplona, huge crowds assembled to cheer on the rebels in a festival-like atmosphere. Local Carlist militia, monarchists backing a pretender to the Spanish throne, marched through the city centre in their red berets covered with crosses and rosaries, singing the charming ditty, quote, "Give me my beret, give me my rifle. I'm going to kill more Reds than there are flowers in April and May," end quote. Right from the start, the purging of leftists and opponents was a top rebel priority. Even in areas that willingly embraced the coup, horrific massacres took place. General Mola, the director of the coup, explicitly spelled this out in a speech to rebel-supporting mayors. Quote, "It is necessary to spread terror. We have to create the impression of mastery, eliminating without scruples or hesitation all those who do not think as we do. There can be no cowardice. If we vacillate one moment and fail to proceed with the greatest determination, we will not win. Anyone who helps or hides a communist or a supporter of the Popular Front will be shot," end quote. In some of the northwestern cities with industry, the working class tried to resist, but unarmed workers were no match for the police, Falangists, and troops. The whole northwest was soon under rebel control, with the important exceptions of the Basque Country and the Asturias, where the miners had revolted back in 1934. Even here the rebels won a key victory, seizing control of the regional capital of Oviedo, thanks to a cunning ploy. The local military commander, Colonel Aranda, had managed over the previous months to convince the civil governor and most of the workers' leaders that he was loyal to the government. Aranda, insisting that he was acting on Madrid's orders, refused to hand over any weapons to them. The civil governor, reassured by his promises of loyalty, described him to the workers' leaders as a man of honour. Aranda then suggested, in complete good faith of course, that it might be a good idea for the miners to march to Madrid to defend the Republic. They mustn't worry about Oviedo. He would take good care of it in their absence. As soon as the miners had left, he declared for the rising. The trusting governor was among the first to be executed once Aranda's troops and civil guards secured the town. After the workers realized they had been betrayed, they surrounded the town, and a long and bloody siege began. In the south they had some successes too, taking Granada, Cordoba, and most importantly, Seville. There was some doubt the coup could succeed in Seville, as it had a large working-class population. That it did was mainly due to the craziest man in the army, General Capo de Llano, a flamboyant fire-eater who had once ordered the entire Spanish army to grow moustaches within 24 hours. Nationalist legends later claimed he captured the city with just 150 men. Actually, he had 4,000. But it was still a masterpiece of improvisation, bluff, and swagger. Arriving at the San Hermenegildo infantry barracks, Capo found the 6th Regiment drawn up on parade, fully armed. He went straight to the colonel to congratulate him on joining the rising. However, the colonel told him he was for the Republic. Putting on his most charming smile and throwing an arm around the colonel's shoulders, he somehow persuaded him to have a chat in private. Once they were in the naive colonel's office, he knocked him out and tied him up. Looking for an officer who would cooperate and lead the regiment, he then called the rest in one by one. Amazingly, none of them saw anything suspicious about this, until they refused and were then arrested. Eventually, he found a Falangist-supporting captain who agreed to join the rebels and lead the 6th. With the barracks under control, he next had to deal with the industrial workers who were mobilizing to stop the rebel takeover of Seville. They actually outnumbered his force, and the rebels were vulnerable until reinforcements could arrive from Africa, especially since they so far only controlled the city centre and the aerodrome. He came up with a cunning scheme of parading his men round and round the city to give the impression of infinite strength, while some of the soldiers stained their faces with walnut juice to convince workers that the Moors had already arrived. The bluff succeeded, and the workers fatally hesitated to attack. Soon the Army of Africa would arrive, and with them came death. These were the success stories of the coup: northwestern Spain, some cities in the south, Spanish Morocco, and most of the Balearic and Canary Islands. In the rest of Spain, particularly in the big cities, things weren't going well. The military had known that taking Madrid was going to be difficult. The forces in the capital were effectively meant to seize the city centre and then endure a siege until rebel reinforcements from Barcelona and Saragossa could reach them. For such an important target, however, the coup here was badly organised and incompetently led. Originally, General Morenti was meant to be in charge in the capital. However, he was detained and replaced by the elderly, infirm and indecisive General Villegas. Rather like a Spanish Hamlet, he wasted precious time dithering over what to do and which side to leap on. Finally, at the last minute, he decided he didn't want anything to do with the coup, and General Joaquin Fanjul stepped in instead. This had big consequences, as no supplies had been set aside for a siege, and little planning had been done. Fanjul showed little enthusiasm, seeming to have volunteered out of duty, and regarding the whole operation as a death sentence. As we shall see, he wasn't wrong. As Fanjul prepared to make his move, Madrid was in turmoil. The Republican government had tried to negotiate with the rebels, but this had provoked a grassroots uprising from the people. Trade unionists took over police duties, socialists, some brandishing pistols or ancient carbines, careered around the Puerta del Sol in placarded taxis. Anarchists in red sashes and Phrygian caps gave the clenched fist salute as they drove requisitioned Cadillacs up and down the Gran Via. Loudspeakers blared La Pasionaria's echo of Marshal Petain's Verdun slogan, "No pasarán," or "They shall not pass." If you thought Gandalf said it first in Lord of the Rings, I'm afraid you are wrong. Crowds converged on the Ministry of War, shouting, quote, "Traitors! Cowards!" end quote. The government fell, and a new administration under José Giral took power. They were prepared to do whatever it took to win, including arming the people, even if it could lead to revolution. On Sunday the 19th July, truckloads of rifles were distributed to trade union members, many of whom had no idea how to use them and clicked their bolts excitedly like castanets. The trouble was that only 5,000 out of the 65,000 rifles had bolts. The rest were stored in the rebel-held Montana barracks, where the battle for Madrid was about to begin. Fanjul had assembled a force of 2,500 officers, soldiers, monarchists and Falangists at the Montana barracks on the 19th of July. They headed towards the city centre and met a huge crowd of 8,000 assorted socialists, anarchists and communists, some of whom were armed. Amid the screaming and taunting, shots rang out, and the rebels were forced to flee back to the barracks. The angry Republicans surrounded them, and a siege began.
miliciano, los moros no pasarán, no pasarán, no pasarán.
It's approaching midday, and the sun is beating down relentlessly. You can feel the sweat pouring off your forehead, but you dare not move a muscle. Before today, you were a metal worker and a member of the Socialists. Now you are on the front lines of the battle against the fascists. You are taking cover behind a park bench. The already familiar sound of the crack of rifle shots echo out from the direction of the barracks, some ricocheting off the cobbled stones in front of you. The lucky few with guns return fire against the rebels. One elderly man with an ancient revolver laughs with glee as he fires bullets into the thick stone walls, doing little damage. The drone of an aircraft comes from overhead. And you hope they are dropping something more lethal than leaflets this time. Your wish comes true as the whistling sound of bombs fills the air. Huge explosions erupt in the barracks, throwing stones and masonry up into the sky. A massive cheer bellows out from thousands of throats. When the dust clears, you spot a white flag flying from a window. Someone yells out, "They're surrendering! We've won! Power to the people!" As one, the crowd surges towards the barracks, but the gates remain closed. You slow down, a sense of unease building in your stomach. Then, suddenly, machine gun fire erupts and waves of lead smash into your comrades. The once ecstatic crowd are now screaming in terror. Some men fall silently to the floor, others yelling out in agony. Soon, all around you lie dead and wounded. As you turn to flee back to your park bench, you see the old man who had the revolver lying on the ground. Crimson liquid stained the cobbles around him. Picking up his gun, you promise his spirit that you will make good use of it. The barracks will fall. The fascists shall not pass. As Republican aircraft dropped leaflets and then bombs on the barracks, the rebels were trapped like rats in a cage, and were getting increasingly desperate. The officers and phalangists wanted to fight on. However, many of the common soldiers wanted to surrender and waved white flags from their windows. The crowds outside ran joyfully forward, but just as we saw in the dramatization, the machine guns commanded by officers opened up again, killing many. Thinking this had been a deliberate trick, the mob was now in a truly murderous mood. No quarter was going to be given. Finally, a sergeant with Republican sympathies managed to throw open the gate before being shot down by an officer. As the crowd surged inside, many of the surrendering rebels were massacred. Soon the courtyard was littered with dead, uniformed bodies. A wounded General Fanjul was captured and then executed after a trial. Some of the monarchists and phalangists were able to escape in the chaos, as they were wearing civilian clothes, living to fight another day. All in all, the coup had failed miserably in Madrid. Even worse news was coming from Barcelona, where the fiercest fighting of the whole uprising would take place. The anarchists were dominant in the city, and they knew the fate that awaited them if the generals succeeded. As soon as word got out about the uprising, they began to mobilize the whole city against it. Gun shops were raided, friendly soldiers handed over arsenals. Homemade grenades were manufactured from a dynamite shipment in the port. And a nice Mad Max-style twist, cars and lorries were requisitioned and metal workers fixed crude armor plating, while sandbags were piled behind truck cabs. When the rebels attacked, the anarchists and their socialist allies were waiting for them. As dawn came on the 19th of July, a tense, silent atmosphere gripped Barcelona. The city was unusually colourful, filled with posters and national flags from all around the world, as the popular Olympiad, organised as a boycott of the now infamous 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany, were due to open the next morning. The event was forgotten in the threatening crisis, and the foreign athletes waited uneasily in their hotels and dormitories. Many of them joined the fighting the next day, alongside the workers, and around 200 later joined the militia columns. Then, the rebels made their move. Soldiers in the Pedrabbles barracks were given rum rations by their officers, then told that orders had been received from Madrid to crush an anarchist uprising. This lie would come back to haunt the plotters. It's always better to use troops loyal to your cause, rather than those who will turn on you if they find out they have been duped. Phalangists and other supporters wearing old bits of uniform joined the column as it set off up the diagonal, one of the major thoroughfares of Barcelona. Almost immediately, factory sirens all over the city sounded the alarm. The rebel troops were overconfident of victory as they headed to the city centre, chanting, quote, "The rabble will run like rabbits as soon as they hear the cannons thunder," end quote. Instead of a walkover, they entered a shooting gallery. Many of the columns were ambushed along the way, encountering barricades made from paving stones, which were strong enough to survive light artillery strikes. Snipers targeted them from above, while Republican forces lobbed homemade grenades, and in some cases, as we saw in the opening dramatization, heavy lorries were even driven in suicidal attacks when the rebels tried to put up their own barricades. Some of the rebels still managed to reach the city centre and seize the Hotel Colon and the Ritz and the Central Telephone Exchange, but soon found themselves under siege. The real turning point of the fighting occurred near the vital port of Barcelona. The rebels found to their horror that the defenders had improvised mobile barricades using forklift trucks and huge rolls of newsprint. Repeated assaults and artillery strikes failed to move them. As the rebels retreated to regroup, the dock workers pushed the large rolls of paper towards them and fired on the retreating soldiers, routing the regiment. As a final touch, a small group of workers rushed across to an insurgent artillery detachment with two 75mm guns. They held their rifles above their heads to show that they were not attacking, astonishing the soldiers. Out of breath, they poured forth passionate arguments about why the soldiers should not fire on their brothers and sisters, telling them that they'd been tricked by their officers. The guns were turned around and brought to bear on the rebel forces. From then on, more and more soldiers joined the defenders. When the leader of the rebels, General Manuel Goded, finally arrived from the Balearic Islands, it was already too late. By 3 o'clock, only the Captaincy General, the Carmelite Convent, and the Drassanes barracks were still in rebel hands. Goded refused to believe that the Spanish army could be defeated by mere workers and wanted to fight on. But after the captaincy was pounded by artillery captured from his own forces, he finally surrendered. Many Republicans wanted to shoot this leading conspirator on the spot, but he was saved by a communist, Caridad Mercader, ironically the mother of Leon Trotsky's assassin. Goded was persuaded to broadcast a statement over the radio to save further bloodshed. Quote, "This is General Goded. I make this declaration to the Spanish people. The fate has been against me, and I am a prisoner. I am saying this so that all those who are still fighting need feel no further obligation towards me." End quote. His words were of great help to the left-wing forces in other parts of Spain, especially in Madrid, where they were broadcast over loudspeakers to the rebels defending the Montana barracks. But agreeing to make the statement did not save him. A court-martial of Republican officers in August condemned him to death for rebellion. After early successes, the rebel leaders were now deluged with bad news. In Madrid, Barcelona and Valencia, the coup had failed, the three biggest cities in Spain. Even worse, the supposed figurehead of the nationalist cause, General Sanjurjo, continued his appalling luck with coups. The airplane carrying him to rebel-held territory crashed due to, I kid you not, being overloaded with all the dress uniforms he insisted on taking. This fiery end filled me with so many questions, like exactly how many uniforms did he try to stuff into this small plane? Sadly, I couldn't find any details. Killed by his vanity, it was a suitably biblical fate for the Lion of the Rif. Yet, on another level, the coup had been successful. The Republic had been destroyed. It would stagger on, with the various factions pretending its institutions still had any meaning. But true power now lay in the streets and the various regions. Andrew Nin of the POUM, Trotsky-supporting communists, opposed to the Stalin-supporting communists. The Spanish Civil War left can be a bizarre alphabet soup of rival factions, mockingly declared that, quote, the government does not exist. We collaborate with them, but they can do no more than sanction whatever is done by the masses. End quote. The Basques, socialists and communists were dominant in the remaining Republican territories in the northwest. Catalonia was an anarchist fief, while the rest of Spain was divvied up for now between socialists, communists and various local militias. If this grassroots response to the coup had kept the rebels from seizing power, it would also make fighting a war terribly difficult for the Republican side. Behind the Republican lines, a social revolution swept through society, especially in Barcelona. The first target in the Catalonian city was inevitably the church. About 700 clergy were murdered, and there was an orgy of iconoclasm as the sacred images of the rich were smashed, and almost every religious building in Barcelona was put to the torch. On the night of the 19th of July 1936, the city was honeycombed with fire, and, as a witness wrote, quote, church walls rose up translucent and gold with flames, each tiny pinnacle and turret bright against the sky. End quote. There were further atrocities. Priest ears were cut off and passed around like those of bulls. Nuns' corpses were exhumed and exhibited, even to children, in a variety of disgusting poses and states of decomposition. Meanwhile, thousands of killings took place, starting with supporters of the coup, both real and imagined, and then moving on to brutal faction fights and score settling. It didn't help that the anarchists had released all the prisoners and let many join its ranks out of a naive sense of brotherhood. These same individuals went on a looting and murdering spree that shook the whole city. Indeed, soon they were being hired by the rival left-wing factions to assassinate their opponents. An anarchist leader wailed that, quote, the underworld is disgracing the revolution, end quote. But in reality, they only had themselves to blame. It wasn't all bloodshed, though. For a little while at least, the working classes were truly in control of the city. The inhabitants of slums such as the sordid, evil-smelling Fifth District took possession of the Ramblas, Barcelona's fanciest area. Formerly the preserve of smart men in felt hats and fashionable women wearing the latest dresses from the Parisian catwalks, now it was filled with manual workers and loudspeakers blaring out revolutionary songs into the small hours. I bet that got annoying after a while. Waiters refused tips, beggars vanished, and illiterate militiamen could be seen laboriously spelling out ballads about proletarian brotherhood, or trying to make sense of anarchist manifestos with titles such as The Organization of Indiscipline. There was such a mania for collectivization that everything from mines to brothels were taken over by the workers. Fun fact, the brothels came under the authority of the catering union. I can see their point. The famously aloof and prestigious Ritz Hotel even became a public canteen, shedding the light of its chandeliers on diners who had not previously been permitted to darken its doors. For a certain kind of foreign leftist observer, it appeared to be a paradise. Yet militarily, the results of all this were decidedly mixed. With the majority of the army in revolt and the rest abolished, people's militias became the main defence of the Republic. Their quality, especially in the first few months, was often terrible. Regarding their officers as equals, getting the same pay, eating the same food, wearing the same uniforms, these ragtag volunteers had little in common with standard soldiers. The crowds cheer as the first column heading to Madrid marches through the streets. Flowers are thrown, pretty girls kiss the men. Seemingly the whole city has come out to send them off. It's an awe-inspiring sight. How can the rebels expect to stand against such men, you think proudly? You only wish you were old enough to fight yourself. Still smiling hours later, you notice your neighbour's oldest son, Carlos, running by with his rifle. He was part of the column. Why has he come back? You shout out to him, "Carlos, what has happened? Why have you returned?" He stops for a moment. "We forgot food and supplies. The men are hungry. I have come back to ask for anything that can be spared." As he runs off again, the first hints of doubt filled your mind. Didn't anyone think of this beforehand? How can you win a war if you forget to feed your soldiers? That's right. In their hurry and lack of training, they forgot to take any supplies. Lorries had to be filled up with whatever local grocery stores could provide and rushed to the column. The militias also sported a bizarre assortment of weapons. Some carried arquebuses and pikes. Villagers near Toledo equipped themselves with a collection of armour worthy of Don Quixote: swords, lances, breastplates and bucklers. They were also desperately short of arms and ammunition. While the first Soviet advisors reported back to Moscow that in August and early September 1936 there was only one rifle per 3 men and one machine gun per 200 men. They were untrained, prone to deserting their posts to pick grapes, and often went home for the weekends. Worst of all, these ill-led units were almost as hostile to one another as to the forces of Franco, almost as intent on destroying capitalism as on killing fascists. Foreigners were appalled by them. The British communist poet John Cornford said that, quote, "showed not the slightest sign of military discipline," end quote. Or the famous author George Orwell claimed that the position held by his unit might have been easily stormed by, quote, 20 Girl Guides armed with battledores, end quote. As revolution gripped the Republican zone, another problem had arisen for the nationalists. They had been confident that the Navy would support the coup, as most of its officers had been sympathetic to the rebels. However, they underestimated the lower ranks. On most ships, the humble sailors were able to overpower their officers and seize control. Franco had been relying on the Navy to ferry the Legion and the Army of Africa to the mainland. Suddenly, it looked as though he was stuck in Morocco. This was a critical moment for the rebels. The coup had failed, a drawn-out civil war seemed likely, and now their best shock troops couldn't reach the mainland. It was at this critical moment that both sides looked to the outside world for support. The responses they got would help decide the course of the war. The nationalists, of course, looked to the fascist regimes in Rome and especially Berlin for help. As was normal for fascist Italy, Benito Mussolini's Spanish policy was egotistical and off the cuff. In the words of a leading Italian diplomat, quote, "The Duchy lacks the patience which mediocre men have to go deeply into problems in the spirit of continuous application of men who lack imagination. Anything that is not spontaneous intuition fails to attract and seduce him. In this way he creates around himself a dangerous atmosphere of messianic expectation, which he enjoys as a sign of blind faith in him. End quote. He had been trying to stir up trouble in Spain since the 1920s, and was at least aware that the 1936 coup was going to happen. The developing civil war in Spain was an opportunity to show off his anti-communist credentials. Would it ally in the Mediterranean, and probably most of all, further burnish the so-called glory Mussolini had won invading Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia? Vast Italian resources would soon be on their way to the nationalist side. As for Germany, originally the foreign policy establishment wanted to stay out of the conflict. It was the personal decision of Adolf Hitler to get involved. There was no sentiment in this, not even really a shared anti-communism with the nationalists. Spain offered up numerous opportunities for the Nazi regime. The German economy, particularly the rearmament program, would benefit from the import of Spanish minerals on favourable terms. It would distract from German moves in the east, and finally Spain would become, as the German tank commander Wilhelm von Thoma memorably remarked, quote, a European Aldershot, end quote, a place to test out the tactics and weaponry that would soon become infamous in the Second World War. It was the German Junker 52 aircraft that would save the nationalist revolt. A vast fleet of Junkers ferried the Army of Africa and the Spanish Foreign Legion across the Straits of Gibraltar to the mainland. The first great airlift in history was given the Wagnerian codename Magic Fire. From July the 19th to October the 11th, 1936, the Germans transported at least 14,000 men to join the nationalist cause. German help would have one more major consequence for Spain. Hitler specified that all German support would go through Franco, giving him a major edge over his rivals. When General Moeller heard this, the director who had actually organised and planned the coup in the first place, he threw an absolute fit. While the fascist powers showered the rebels with support, the Republic looked to Paris and London for help. It was going to be disappointed. Britain was very dubious about the Republican government even before the revolt. It had vast commercial interests in Spain and had no intention of allowing a red government to nationalise them. If anything, it leaned slightly towards the nationalists, with British society making much of Franco's, quote, praiseworthy golf handicap, end quote. The little things that decide the fate of nations. From British-held Gibraltar, for example, the Royal Navy provided supplies and other assistance, while the Gordon Highlanders nearly drowned one of Franco's airmen in whiskey when toasting a quick victory. Paris was led by a left-wing Popular Front government under Léon Blum, similar to the one that had come to power in Spain in 1936. Surely these ideological allies would come to the Republic's aid. Surprisingly, they didn't. At first it seemed as though France would back the Republican side, with Blum sending ancient aeroplanes to Madrid. But France itself was a very divided nation. Blum had come to power after extensive rioting in Paris between right and left. Afraid that supporting Republican Spain would undermine his new government, and fed dispiriting information by the same French generals, whose defeatism would lead to the triumph of Hitler, Blum lost his nerve. To avoid doing anything while still giving their actions a sheen of morality, Paris and London came up with a dodge. Britain has many talents, one of which is creating useless committees led by titled oafs that do nothing and are expected to do nothing, mainly to save a government's blushes. That is exactly what they did. The Non-Intervention Committee was set up in London, under the chairmanship of a patrician nincompoop named Lord Plymouth. Far from stopping intervention in the Civil War, it allowed the democracies to do nothing, while they elaborately ignored Italian, German, and later Soviet weaponry and advisors flooding in. Germany treated it with such disdain that it barely bothered to hide the fact it was pouring in weaponry, thinly disguised in crates marked Christmas decorations. When the committee was confronted with questions on why there was suddenly such a high demand for Christmas decorations in nationalist-held Spain, it dismissed them as rumours and hearsay. America was little better, with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt declaring a moral embargo on weapons sales to Spain, later upgraded to a formal embargo. Behind this, however, a blind eye was turned to American companies rushing to support the nationalists. The president of the Texas Oil Company was an admirer of fascists, and on receiving news of the rising, diverted 5 tankers en route for Spain to the nationalist port of Tenerife, which had a large refinery. Then Shell Standard provided Franco with all the oil he could ever need on credit. Later on, Ford, Studebaker, and General Motors supplied 12,000 trucks to the nationalists, nearly 3 times as many as the Axis powers, and the chemical giant DuPont provided 40,000 bombs, sending them via Germany so as to circumvent the US Neutrality Act. In 1945, the Undersecretary at the Spanish Foreign Ministry admitted that, quote, "Without American petroleum and American trucks and American credit, we could never have won the Civil War," end quote. Denied help by London, Paris, and Washington, D.C., who were often helping their enemies to one degree or another, Republican Spain was forced to turn to the Soviet Union. Even this support, however, as we shall see in the next episode, came with a hell of a lot of strings. With the Army of Africa arriving at the Seville airdrome, the whole city soon fell to the nationalists. In the working-class districts, the Foreign Legion and Moroccan soldiers went up and down the modest one-story houses, throwing grenades in the windows, blowing up and killing women and children, taking the opportunity to loot and rape at will. Meanwhile, General Capo discovered he was skilled as a radio shock jock. He took to the airways of Spain from Radio Seville with fiery sermons and threats. For example, he vowed that village Republicans would be ruthlessly hunted down. Quote, "If they hide beneath the earth, I shall dig them out. Even if they're already dead, I shall kill them again." End quote. With Seville pacified, and much of Andalusia in the south now under nationalist control, Franco split his forces in 2. One travelled along the Spanish border with Portugal to link up with Mola's forces in the north. The other advanced on Madrid. While Republican militias have fought well in urban environments, they struggled fighting on open ground, and were often little match for the elite Army of Africa. Advancing in fleets of multicoloured coaches, their roofs stacked with provisions and loot, their radiators decked with mascots ranging from the Virgin Mary to Mickey Mouse, these hardened troops constantly outflanked the raw Republicans, who had no capacity to manoeuvre and stuck to the roads. It didn't help that the militiamen had little idea of how to prepare defensive positions, and were desperately afraid of finding themselves facing the Moroccans' knives alone. Outflanking movements which took them by surprise usually led to a panic-stricken stampede. Chaos was increased when the population of a village clogged the roads with their carts and donkeys as they too fled from the colonial troops. Sometimes they even seized the militia lorries for themselves. On the other hand, the nationalist tactic of terror provoked heroism as well as flight. Peasants, having seen their families on their way, would take up shotguns or abandon rifles and return to die in their homes. Still, the nationalist advance along the Portuguese border appeared unstoppable. Soon, only the town of Badajoz stood in their way. Badajoz was defended by no more than 2,000 poorly armed militiamen and 500 regular soldiers. The nationalists launched a pincer attack at 5:30 in the afternoon, with the Foreign Legion assaulting 2 of the gates under the cover of artillery fire. They broke into the town and the slaughter began. Fighting from house to house with grenade and bayonet, the nationalists made no distinction between combatant or civilian. When the fighting ended, militiamen and civilians were herded to the local bullring, one of the most infamous atrocities of the whole war. was about to take place. The air in the recently conquered city stinks of cordite and smoke. A familiar scent, even in your short period of service with the Legion. Originally from London in the UK, you'd always been obsessed with adventure and exploits in foreign lands, but you were beginning to wonder if joining the Spanish Foreign Legion was the best way of living your dream. Your fellow legionnaires curse, kick and beat the prisoners as they corral them into the city's bullring. A huge Bulgarian, more ogre than man, seems to take pleasure in the beatings, eyeing you suspiciously when he sees you're not participating. Inside the bullring is a vision of hell. Machine guns are mounted on platforms along its sides, while the audience seats are filled with officers and wealthy-looking aristocrats. They laugh and hurl abuse at the prisoners. One richly dressed woman stands up and screams out, "You wanted land, you ignorant rabble? We'll give it to you. 6 feet of it." The audience bursts into laughter and shouts of agreement. As the doors of the bullring close, you are anxious to get away, but a huge hand grips your shoulder. It's the Bulgarian. "English, it's time to prove yourself," he says with a cruel smile. He escorts you into the audience section and demands you man a machine gun. To be a bridegroom of death is to be damned in the eyes of man and God, to do what other men never could. Now it's your turn, English. He mans the machine gun next to you, where you can feel the cold stares of your fellow legionnaires on your back, waiting to kill you if you don't fire. The Bulgarian's face is filled with glee and excitement as he aims at the crowd, while you try and remain cool on the outside, while the inside you're gripped by terror and indecision. "Fire!" yells your officer. You close your eyes and pull the trigger. 4,000 would be slaughtered in the Badajoz bullring in just a few days. The Bulgarian was a real person who terrorized Badajoz, getting his comeuppance a few days later when a mine blew off his legs. Volunteers in the Legion from democracies were often viewed with suspicion until they had been bloodied. If you didn't prove yourself, death came at the hands of your comrades. Badajoz became the last rebel atrocity that the commanding officers would openly talk about. A journalist remembers the local commander boasting to him, quote, "Of course we shot them. He said to me, 'What do you expect?' Was I supposed to take 4,000 Reds with me as my column advanced, racing against time? Was I expected to turn them loose in my rear and let them make Badajoz red again?" End quote. After news of the massacre hurt the nationalist image abroad, Franco demanded censorship, and they denied any future wrongdoing. Meanwhile, the looting of even nationalist supporters' property was explained by one officer as, quote, "the war tax they pay for salvation," end quote. Officers organised the dispatch of the Moroccans' booty back to their families at home because it helped recruiting. The legionnaires did not burden themselves with the often useless objects which the Moors collected. They simply examined the mouths of the dead and smashed out any gold-capped teeth with their rifle butts. With the fall of Badajoz, the nationalist zones had been linked up. Virtually all of western and northwestern Spain was under their control. It seemed that Madrid too would soon fall. That it didn't is partly because of a controversial decision that Franco now made. Rather than keep up the advance on Madrid, he turned aside from the capital to raise the siege of Toledo's Alcazar, one of the most famous episodes in the Civil War. The Alcazar was the drab granite military academy that dominated the ancient city. Here, an obscure grey-bearded colonel, José Moscado, whose main interest was football, collected a scratch force of 1,100 soldiers, Sybil guards and phalangists, and raised the red and gold standard of Spain. Ironically, no one had bothered to tell him about or involve him in the coup. He just decided to join in. Unable to dislodge them, Republican militias took their revenge on local priests, none of whom had joined Moscardo. Other fascists, defined by their possession of servants, were also executed. Then the siege of the Alcazar began. Sniper bullets ring out like a lethal symphony as shells smash into the fortress. You've been trapped here by the Reds for weeks, existing on mule stew and stagnant water. Your uniform has long ago disintegrated. Instead, you are dressed in French Napoleonic uniforms from the Fortress Museum. If it wasn't for the chatter of machine guns and the planes occasionally dropping bombs, you could almost be back in the early 19th century. Suddenly, a huge explosion erupts, seemingly from the bowels of the earth itself. Men are thrown up in the air, and one of the walls comes crashing down. It was a mine, and now the dust is clearing. You can see Reds pouring towards the breach. Grabbing your machine gun, you rain bullets down upon them, stifling through their ranks. A bullet almost strikes your head, leaving a nick on your cheek. But still you continue firing. As the Reds finally retreat, men leap up to the barricade where the wall once stood. May the Virgin Mary and God send relief soon. You don't know how much longer you can all hold on for. The Republicans tried everything to break into the Alcazar. Shells breached the thick bastions, planes bombed it from above, while huge mines were detonated underneath it, with the explosions being heard more than 40 miles away in Madrid. The attackers even tried to set fire to it with burning petrol, but still the defenders hung on. Moscardo's son, Louis, was captured and made to tell his father that he would be shot if the Alcazar did not surrender. Their final dialogue echoed around the world. Quote, "If it is true," replied Moscardo, "commend your soul to God, shout Viva España, and die like a hero. Goodbye, my son. A kiss." His son replied, "Goodbye, father. A very big kiss." End quote. Shortly before the relief force arrived, his son was killed. Moving though this may be, it should not obscure the fact that Moscardo himself killed about 100 left-wing hostages inside the Alcazar. Still, there is no denying the courage of its 70-day resistance. Though this diversion probably cost Franco the capital, it would cement his claim to the leadership of the nationalists, much to Mola's fury. At the rebel capital of Burgos, Franco was acclaimed Caudillo, or chieftain of the rebel cause. He had been lucky. Sanjurjo was dead, Mola discredited by the failure of the coup, and Capo was opposed by the monarchists. Still, the relief of the Alcazar sealed the deal. Now, he ordered 3 nationalist armies to march on Madrid. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In the next episode, the Battle of Madrid begins. As the capital stands alone against the might of Franco's Army of Africa, aid from the Soviet Union finally starts to arrive, and the famous international brigades enter the conflict. But Stalin's help would come with a hefty price tag. The very soul of the revolution itself would soon be under threat. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.